pleased I am to be back here. And how pleased I am to see familiar faces again. It's always it's a great pleasure to come back here. In particular, to Turin, in particular on the day when Italy celebrates its 150 years of unification. I mean, it's important for me as well, because of course I have a Polish background, and the Poles also celebrate their unification. In fact, one of the more shocking consequences of Polish unification was the discovery that Polish people can be just as oppressive as foreigners. And when Poland unified, that became very, very apparent. So I hope in Italy, I trust in Italy because it was a more humane experience. Okay, the politics. The life of Minsky. Hyman P. Minsky was an American economist of Eastern European Jewish origin. His English is actually sometimes difficult to read. It's very clotted. And he said to a friend of mine who had been his former student that the reason why he wrote so badly in English is that it wasn't his first language, because his first language was Yiddish, the language of the East European Jews.
What is it?
Yiddish.
Yiddish?
Yeah. Yiddish is a kind of German it's a German dialect, really. And I would say that in the part of Eastern Europe where you came from, if you spoke Yiddish, you considered yourself to be cultured, because the poorest, most uneducated Jews spoke Russian. They were considered pretty low. But Minsky was brought up in Chicago in a very radical household, in a household that is in the 1930s that sympathized with not so much with communism but with Trotskyism, and his mother in particular was very active, politically very, very active. Minsky was bright and went to the University of Chicago to study mathematics, actually not economics, but mathematics. And at Chicago he met the Polish Marxist Oskar Langer. Langer was unusual in being at Chicago in that Chicago was always associated with free market liberal economics. Langer also believed in free market liberal economics, but he believed that that was something that had existed at an early stage of capitalism, and that the tendency in capitalism, as Marx put forward, was for monopolies to emerge, and those monopolies would then ensure, would prevent market mechanisms from bringing about a nice equilibrium in society, so in the economy. So in this respect, Langer actually fitted in rather neatly in Chicago, in that he believed that a free market system would bring you full employment and all the rest of it, except that he believed that you could no longer get back to that. And the implication of this was that in Chicago was that the Great Depression was caused by the fact that there were monopolies which were preventing markets from flexibly adjusting to equilibrium. In Chicago, so Langer met this young radical and said to him that if he wanted a socialist America, he should study economics. And that's how Minsky came to study economics, and was hugely successful at it. Minsky, as I will go on to describe, is the theorist of financial instability. When the present crisis happened, it was Minsky's name that was on everyone's lips. Suddenly, from having been ignored by a lot of people, he was, his were the books that were looked at, his works were looked at. The financial crisis was described as a Minsky moment. I will say later on what this means. At Chicago, Minsky fell under the influence of another economist called Henry Simons. Simons was also very liberal, but he was someone who believed that the crisis of the 1930s had been caused by the banking system. There was something wrong with the banking system. And Simons therefore believed that the only way in which free market capitalism, the free market capitalism that he believed in, could work properly is if you had a very, very highly regulated banking system. So you have the radical Minsky coming into Chicago, meeting Marx, Langer, but also these other liberals, and really studying economics because he wanted to know what was wrong with capitalism. And it's interesting to contrast this with how he ended up. By the time he died in 1996, Minsky was a liberal Democrat who believed in, had a Keynesian view that capitalism can be made to work if it's guided sufficiently by the state. So it's a much more belief in managed capitalism with a strong state. What happened in between is quite interesting, because after he finished his studies, he went into the army, travelled a little bit in Europe, so with the American army in Europe, and then went back. He spent 1 year on Wall Street, and that was a very, very formative year because it changed his whole outlook on the economy. And then he was offered a grant to do a PhD, a scholarship to do a PhD. He was offered one in Chicago, but he didn't go back to Chicago for a number of reasons, but some of them were personal. One of those reasons was that Simons, with whom he had become a good friend, Simons suffered from what they call nowadays called bipolar syndrome. He was manic. He was he had a tendency to depression, and he committed suicide. In fact, I was told by David Laidler that he committed suicide because he could see Keynesianism coming on, and he was so disliked this. But I'm not sure that this would be a reason. But if you were a depressive type,
but
you could.
Commit suicide.
Sorry?
He did commit suicide.
Yeah, he committed suicide. Yeah. I mean, the story is that Schumpeter took to the bottle and drank himself to death because of the onset of Keynesianism. because this was vanity. Schumpeter believed that he was the greatest economist of the 20th century, and he didn't like to be beaten by this. So that was one reason why he didn't go back. One personal reason. The other personal reason is even more curious because it was the shift in the position of Oscar Lange. Lange in the 1930s had been, he was a Marxist. He was critical of what had happened in the Soviet Union. And in fact, he put forward a model of socialism, a very curious model of socialism in which the economy is not run by the government, it's run by the central bank. So this was the kind of central bank socialism. And Lange mixed with a number of independent Marxists who were equally critical of the Soviet Union, but who believed that capitalism had to be transformed. In the depths that capitalism couldn't get out of the crisis, it had to be transformed into socialism. In 1944, Lange changed his view and threw in his lot with the communists. He gave up, by then he had American citizenship, he gave up his American citizenship to become the first communist Polish ambassador to the United States, and thereafter really followed the communist line, quite carefully. He became Lange then becomes very Stalinist in some of his views, although he was never brutally Stalinist, but he certainly said things about very nice things about Stalin, which really are incomprehensible now and would have been incomprehensible at that time. Minsky was disgusted by this. He was disgusted that someone who had an independent view, a critical view on capitalism, was now throwing his lot in with a brutal regime which he didn't consider to be socialist. So that was the other reason why he didn't feel like really going back to Chicago. He felt that was now all in the past. He went to Harvard. He was offered a scholarship at Harvard, where his supervisor was Joseph Schumpeter, and then when Schumpeter died, drank himself to death in 1950, as the Russian communist Leontiev. So it was a combination of Schumpeter and Leontiev.
Changed his citizenship.
Sorry?
Leontiev, he changed his citizenship.
Oh, yes, I mean, he was American, yes. Yeah. By then he was Leontiev was an emigre, also actually very, very critical of Keynesianism. I'm not sure, I don't know about Leontiev's politics. But the important thing is that he wrote his doctoral thesis with Schumpeter. Schumpeter was, by then in America, was famous for a couple of things. One, as the students will know, he was a proponent of the liquidationist view in the 1930s. Okay, the liquidationist view being that all that the government should do is try and balance its budget and wait, and the economy would get back to full employment. And when it didn't, it was because of the New Deal. So the New Deal was the obstacle to full employment, not the solution to it. Schumpeter then published in 1939 this massive book, Business Cycles, which is where he puts forward his theory about business cycles being caused by waves of innovation, but it also has a huge amount about finance money. It's one of the great classics. So Minsky took over from this interest in business cycles. He wrote his PhD was actually on the theory of business cycles, and in his doctoral thesis he rejected this mechanistic notion of business cycles, which you find probably prevalent in economics, which is that the business cycle is the interaction of particular variables, whatever those variables might be. And Minsky said this was not, in particular, that it was a combination of the multiplier or the accelerator or the share, the rate of profit, or something else like this, which was mechanically causing the economy to move into a particular trajectory. Minsky argued that this was not the case, that the business cycle was not mechanical, and in particular that these mechanical business cycle models didn't include the possibility of debt. They didn't include finance, they didn't include money, they didn't include debt, and therefore, how could they be proper theories of the business cycle? So he ends up, this is, the PhD thesis was published about 6 years ago. And then you have this curious transition in Minsky that he finished in 1954. Obviously, with having had Schumpeter for his supervisor and Leontiev as his supervisors, he should have got a first-class job. He started publishing American Economic Review. But he gets his PhD at the height of McCarthyism, when anyone suspected of any left-wing sympathies gets into deep trouble and can't get work. People, they lost their jobs. Many of them had to flee America. People committed suicide. It was a terrible time. One of the survivors once described it to me as Stalinism without the labor camps. They didn't have labor camps in America, but if you lost your job, if you lost your accommodation, if you couldn't work, how could you live? And in particular, there was the paranoia and the suspicion of people who had any kinds of left-wing sympathies, or had even worked for the Roosevelt administration in the New Deal. So Minsky comes down to this. He does, I think, for a couple of years. He has temporary jobs. He got a job at the University of California, Berkeley, which was relatively liberal at that time. He held it for about 3 years, but didn't get tenure. In America, the tenure system, this is a system whereby if you work for a certain period of time, you are awarded tenure, which means that you cannot be removed from your post, and it's supposed to protect academic freedom. What it actually does is it means that while you're working for tenure, you have to make sure that you are politically correct, that you do everything correct for, as far as the university authorities are concerned, as far as the political authorities are concerned. So this, the failure to get tenure was a blow to Minsky, and I only met him, I think, about twice. And I had conversations with him, particularly about this period. And he said that, essentially what one did was you covered up. So you have the peculiarity of Minsky that from there on, really for quite a long period of time, he's covering up this radical background, trying to get an academic job, and eventually, and he did get one at a good university, but not a particularly outstanding one. And part of that covering up means that he then starts putting forward his views on his critique of capitalism as essentially a Keynesian view. He has debt in it, he has money in it, so he says this is a Keynesian view. Keynes being relatively acceptable in the United States. So he then, out of this comes his famous financial instability hypothesis. So he puts forward this interpretation of Keynes in his 1975 book, John Maynard Keynes, where he summarizes Keynesian analysis as follows. He says, in Keynes, output and employment are determined by investment. How much the firms invest determines how high employment will be. The second point is that then what determines investment? Investment is determined by finance. So that's where finance comes in. Now, this isn't really Keynes, because Keynes's view was that capitalism is unstable because in the financial markets are unstable. In the financial markets, you can adjust your position very, very quickly. In the real economy, it takes actually quite a long time to do so. So the general theory can be interpreted as an explanation that the way the economy is destabilized, it's destabilized by speculative financial markets. And this is why Keynes comes to the conclusion that you need to manage those markets. In particular, you need what he called the euthanasia of the rentier. You need to kill off the influence of the financial investor. And that's not what Minsky's theory is about. Minsky's theory is a business cycle theory, rooted in Schumpeter, Kalecki, in which the economy is in a constant state of flux, booms followed by recessions, and this has important implications for the way in which the economy, for the efficiency of the economy. Because if you have booms and slumps, successive booms and slumps, actually you only ever get to full employment or near full employment at the peak of the boom. Most of the time, the system is operating in a state of economic inefficiency. It's not making use of all resources. The second this is the key implication. The second implication of it is that if you want to think of capitalism as this dynamic, innovative system, there is evidence for it. In the boom, it doesn't work like this in the recession. Minsky made a number, move now into the theories, a number of innovations in economic theory. The key one is that most economic theories see analyse how people obtain their incomes and how they spend their incomes. So output and expenditure, which are economic flows, as flow variables. Minsky made one major innovation for which, really I think this is the most important innovation, in that he said that actually we don't just operate like this, we operate balance sheets. Everyone has, that firms, banks have balance sheets with assets and liabilities, and that why is this important, or why is this an important innovation? Well, in the income and expenditure view, your cash flow is your income. Your cash outflow is your expenditure. If you have a balance sheet, you have an additional source of cash flow because you can sell assets or issue new debts or issue new liabilities. So your cash flow position is actually rather more sophisticated. Bearing in mind though that you can get additional cash flow in this way, but it means that you're selling assets, so you'll no longer get income from those assets, or you're issuing new liabilities and you can't get income. You'll have to service those liabilities. So from this you get the idea that the economy, the key idea in Minsky, that the economy is driven by debt dynamics. Debt makes us all move in particular, or makes firms. Firms produce, in the standard theory, firms produce in order to generate income to pay their, to make a profit. Minsky says no, don't do it for that reason. Firms produce to pay their debts. People go to work to finance their liabilities. Students finish their studies, go and get work so they can pay off their debts. And that's extraordinary, because it's not the standard view that people, you go to work so you can have an income, so you can consume. Well, yes, that's true, but increasingly what happens is we're operating with these balance sheets. It's being driven by debt. In particular, what happens is that investment, in Minsky's view, is always financed by debt. When firms invest, this investment which is driving, which determines output and employment in Keynes, is financed with debt. And so what that means is that over the course of a boom, the amount of debt in the economy increases. And this is so during a boom, debt is being laid up. And this leads to Minsky's kind of, I think that this is Minsky's most famous, most important innovation. His most famous innovation is actually something else. Financing structures. If I have a financial liability, like a debt, and I have the same amount of money, a bank deposit equal to that debt, then this is what you call a hedged finance. I have my finance, my debts are covered by my money, so I don't need to worry. Speculative finance is if your debts aren't covered with cash, and therefore you are, for some of that debt, you're hoping that the cash will come in the future, but you're not sure. So that's speculation. And then Ponzi finance. He introduces this term, Ponzi finance, named after by Charles Ponzi. Yes, the students know. Charles Ponzi was an Italian immigrant to Boston in 1921. He had a pyramid banking scheme. Now, so Minsky takes this term Ponzi finance, and what he means by this is where the only way in which you can service your debt is by taking out additional debt. So the whole thing increases by exponentially. And quite clear, his argument is that financial crisis, the Minsky moment, comes when hedge finance becomes speculative and speculative becomes Ponzi finance. All this is done with balance sheet finance. I won't go to it. But now, what a particular issue that arises is the servicing of debt. Ideally, debts should be serviced out of income. Okay. If you service your debts from income, then you manage okay. The problem arises if you decide to reduce your debts. You're not just servicing your debt, but you decide to reduce your debts. Because what happens then is you're taking money out of the economy and using it to cancel a debt. So the money, the bank deposit and the debt is cancelled, bank balance sheet shrinks. What happens then is the money is being taken out of the economy. And this is what he called debt deflation. And debt deflation is crucial because while, and I'll come back to this, while he argued that you can increase the debt quite freely, society as a whole cannot reduce its debts. You cannot reduce your debts without driving someone else into debt. So crisis happens when people try to reduce their debts because the reduction in expenditure in the economy means that firms which are producing goods don't get the money back that they've put into circulation. So they end up being short of money. How do they survive? They have a financial deficit. They borrow money. So that one person reduces their debts, someone else has to borrow. If you reduce your debts, someone else has to borrow. Remember this when you pay off your student debts. Don't do that. Don't do that. So Minsky argued that the political implications of all this were counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and so that the government spends more money during a recession or cuts taxes as a way of just stabilising the economy. And he argued that if you stabilise the economy, then these hedge and speculative financing units you can will be sustainable. Debt is sustainable. However, in the longer run, what happens is that he has this phrase, stability is destabilizing. If you take on debt for economic enterprise, you use it in your business, it's successful, you take on more debt. So you take on more and more and more and more debt. Eventually, it comes back to you. The crisis breaks out. There are, I think what Minsky, in this respect, Minsky became rather too Keynesian. Bertrand Russell criticised Keynes for believing that the whole world should be like the University of Cambridge. In other words, a group, collection of highly educated, cultured, rational men who sit around and could discuss and solve all problems together. In that situation, you don't actually have any politics. And in particular, you don't have politics that changes over the course of the business cycle. Where in the boom, the politicians are saying, you know, we've been so successful, you must re-elect us. We're good. And in a recession, the politics changes, you start blaming people. Politics becomes more extreme in a recession. You actually start, during recessions, when there are political difficulties, people start discussing economic problems. They don't do that anymore. So the type of politics changes. Kalecki wrote this famous paper on the political business cycle, which argues this kind of shifting in politics. But in particular, what happens during a recession is that there is a fear of bad debt, particularly amongst banks. That the banks, realizing that a lot of their customers are in difficulties, they worry about that bad debt, and that then gets generalized to governments. And you can see this in Europe today, that there are governments which are spending money to try and keep their economies active, and but they have difficulty in doing this because the financial markets and other politicians are saying, no, you need to get your debts down. You have to be able to repay your debts, which in the Minsky idea, which he got from Irving Fisher, by the way, society as a whole cannot repay its debts. It's in total. All you can do, you can only do actually one of two things. All you can do is either keep increasing the debt, or the typical way in which debt is reduced is through inflation. If you have a period of inflation, that wipes out debt. But of course we can't. That then leads on to the politics of how much inflation can you have. So this fear of bad debt means that you can't do counter-cyclical policy. And this is, I think, a weakness in Minsky. Actually, for all the fact that I put forward Minsky as a Keynesian, he was unusual amongst Keynesians in that he could used to mix with a lot of left-wing economists, and he could talk to them in the same terminology. He also talked to the central bankers in their terminology. Quite unusual, this. Okay, the Greenspan alternative, the alternative that emerged during the 1990s or during the Greenspan chairmanship of the Federal Reserve, is that you don't do fiscal policy, counter-cyclical fiscal policy. You do counter-cyclical monetary policy. This is the Greenspan doctrine that you can't stop booms, you can't stop bubbles, but the central bank, all that the central bank can do is try and prevent a recession by lowering interest rates. And of course, this doesn't work. Let me mention something which emerges. So those are good implications of this. Let me mention something about the legal implication, particular legal implication, which interests me because, in a sense, it brings it's an idea which applies in many developing countries as it does to the most financially sophisticated countries. This is the question of debt as the first call on people's income, or on an economic, as economists say, on an economic unit's income, because either an individual or a legal individual being a firm, if you have debt, you have to pay your debt, service your debts, make the required interest payments, and repay as specified in the contract. Before you do anything else, or if you do anything else, you have to leave enough money for this. Why? Because the law of debt is essentially the law of legal contracts. Now, the point about legal contracts is that they apply to the exchange of goods and services or exchange of assets. If you buy a house, it's a legal contract, and so on. Debt is unusual, and this is what Minsky identified. Debt and financial assets are unusual because, whereas if I buy, if I buy this house, I pay the money for it. Once I've paid the money, there are no further obligations. If I have the money, I have the house now, the person who sold it to me has the money. There are no further financial obligations. With debt and with financial transactions, these are transactions which require future payments or future commitments to pay. And therefore, they're much more complex than standard, the normal transactions. And so the legal foundation for debt is that it's a contract. It's a contract that people enter into voluntarily, and therefore all debt is in some sense voluntary. People enter into it for rational reasons. Rational, adult, responsible people do this, and then find themselves with debts, and debts which, in a situation of the business cycle occurring or economic instability, the significance of that debt can be quite startling. At one extreme, you have what you find in many developing countries, which is India, for example, debt bondage. Every year in India, hundreds of farmers commit suicide because of debt. Or they spend large parts of their lives working not for themselves, but ostensibly to pay off debts. Professional people do the same. In Britain, when, because of most people take out very large debts to buy a house, they spend most of their working lives devoting a large part of their incomes, on servicing that debt. This is money for which they don't get. These are payments for which they don't actually get any return. Well, they get the use of the house, but they get the house, the ownership of the house. But this idea that debt is something which you can enjoy the house. You don't need to own a house to enjoy it. But if you have debt as well, then it ends up. It's a kind of forced. You're forced by circumstances to continue payments to it. This is why in that book which Weber has in front of him, there's a little phrase in there that the road to serfdom leads through finance. The road to debt bondage leads through finance. Hayek thought that it led through Keynesianism. And if you allow the state to operate in the economy, then you end up with a feudal system. But it's not that. It goes through finance. Okay, let me come back to this. The legal doctrine is that people choose debt. In actual fact, what Minsky uncovered, but actually Irving Fisher before him uncovered, was that individuals do not freely choose debt. You get into debt because you need to survive. And debt, and it's either that you have food or you starve. If you need to borrow for food, you borrow for food. And the mechanism that Minsky described, whereby, for example, households repay their debts out of their income, and by taking that, by reducing their expenditure because they're repaying debts, they are reducing the revenue that firms get, and this drives firms into debt. This idea that you cannot reduce debt in the economy, it's a compulsory thing, it really means that this legal notion that it's a free contract, it's a contract between free individuals, is wrong. Again, there's a very nice phrase in that book. At the start of it, there's a quotation from François Rabelais, the French writer, in which he Gargantua Pantagruel, of course, he wrote, "Not everyone is a debtor who wishes to be. Not everyone who wishes makes a creditor." Even Rabelais had recognised that it's not a free choice. So, what you're doing is you actually, by repaying your debt, you're actually transferring the debt onto someone else. You can see this most vividly in Britain. Since I last saw you, my students at SOAS have been in occupation. They've been tearing down police cordons and because of student fees. Why? Because what the British government wants to do is reduce its debt by increasing the private debt of people who go to university. And you don't need me to tell you that for society as a whole, this doesn't reduce debt, it just redistributes it. So this leads me on to my conclusion. My conclusion is that Minsky started off as a socialist, as a critic of finance. He ended up with a vague kind of Keynesianism that I think overlooked the political and legal implications of his analysis. And I think if one can do, in a sense, one needs his analysis to be able to understand how debt works in an economy. It has different political implications to the one that he adhered to at the end of his life. Incidentally, he also wrote very nice, I think one of his last essays was a paper on the transition economies of Eastern Europe, where he he argued that they should all have financial systems like the American one. Oh, and by the way, they would also need a counter-cyclical Keynesian policy and all the rest of it. But I think he ended up being rather with a strong belief that actually the American institutions, the way the US was doing was the correct way. And I'm not, I have my doubts. We all have our doubts about this, in the same way that we all have our doubts about European governments as well. So I'll finish off there. And anyone got any questions? I don't know if anyone has questions or anything. Yeah.
Yes. As you say, like Minsky started career as a little bit socialist, and I think one of the point where we see him as a socialist because he, to the changes in economies, he tread on the point on the road of state-owned enterprise.
Yeah.
Yes. So that is the point where he appears to be a socialist. And besides that, I think he's also like he doesn't really agree on the point of debt financing.
Yeah.
But in Chinese economies at the moment, I think at one point they are operating like the state-owned enterprise, and they try to privatize the subsidiaries, state-owned enterprise. But on the other hand, they are developing the commerce bank along with increase of credit in the economy.
Yeah.
So one way they follow Minsky model and one way they don't follow. So is it the point where they have like one of the can we see that as one of the reasons why we have crisis in Chinese economies at the moment?
Well, you don't have a crisis in the Chinese economy.
No.
You have the Chinese economy is actually doing operating very, very along the lines of a lot of what Minsky and Keynes suggests. In other words, you have a system of socialised investment. The government controls the rate of investment in the economy. And it's that keeps the economy growing. It's investment that accounts for the high rates of growth in China. The Minsky element doesn't really come into China because there is a rapid growth of debt, but there's also a rapid growth of financial assets. But there isn't really a debt problem in China. China is not yet driven by debt, and the main reason is because the middle classes cannot find a housing market in which to get themselves into debt, and the companies are actually relatively profitable. The debt situation, if you look at what's happening in the banks are still in a fairly strong position, and they're all state banks as well. So, I would say that China is not doing things in the Minskian way. Let me think what would epitomise. I think that Japan was a good example of a country which invested, and then finally got into this debt crisis. This is really the best example in recent history of debt deflation. And there are all sorts of reasons why this happened. By the way, there are inconsistencies in Minsky's economics as well. But still, he's still the only economist to put forward a theory of financial crisis. Because you can't. The other theories, well, we've been through them all. Kindleberg, this is a psychological one. We're all speculative. We're all speculators.
It's more like behavior.
Yeah, it's a sort of it's mass psychology. Well, you know, there are psychological elements, but this confuses people's experience with the actual explanation of why this happens. So, yeah.
So if like Obama and Merkel called you up and said, help, what would you tell them?
I would tell them not to worry about the debt. Now actually the real problem is how you accommodate this debt in the economy. Which if you consider the debt to GDP ratio for the whole economy, the standard view is that, as I say, you take money out of the real economy to service the debt, to try and reduce the debt. What that actually does is it reduces GDP. You may be reducing the debt, but the ratio of debt to GDP won't change. This was illustrated very, very neatly in the 1990s, though in Greece there were two conservative governments that came to power in Greece in the 1990s, all of them determined to reduce the government debt. The effect of reducing it was in effect to reduce GDP. So that paradoxically, instead of reducing the debt to GDP ratio, they increased it. And I think this is what will happen in Britain. It's what will happen in Europe as well. It's what will happen in America. Now, how do you the Keynesian way, Minsky's idea is that you actually you allow the debt to rise, and then if you have this if you've got the debt GDP, the Keynes and I think Minsky also believe that if you allow the debt to rise, then the GDP will rise faster. But that depends, that really depends. Why should it? If the economy is particularly dynamic, it may be. If there are plenty of unused resources, you may be able to manage it. This is the theory of the Keynesian multiplier. But in fact, this is the problem that the Japanese have been wrestling with for the past, since 1992. Because, yes, the Japanese let their debt go up, and it's gone up and up. And it's now 200% of GDP. 200% of GDP. In Greece, it's 100%. In the US, it's approximately 100%. So it's trying. And in Japan, the debt hasn't gone, but the GDP has not gone up. It's a stagnant economy. What's happening, of course, if we're going to talk, if we mention the crisis now, in Japan, what will now happen is that the recovery from the crisis will push GDP up, as it always does, if you have spending on infrastructure. I don't know what will happen. Probably the debt will go down. But the standard, the usual way in which you reduce this is by inflation. Because if you have inflation, GDP goes up. Just simply in money terms. But because the debt is fixed in money terms, that debt goes down.
So your response would be raise inflation? Yeah.
The key issue is, can you raise inflation? And the Japanese example, the Japanese experience shows that you cannot do this. Central banks do not control inflation. although they claim that they do.
So what would be the response when someone says, but look at Japan? So if we knock out that opportunity, what would be the alternative?
If you say, but look at Japan, I would say, look across the South China Sea at China. What you really need is you need a system which gives you direct control of investment. Actually, the real reason why Japanese the real reason why Japanese GDP doesn't rise is because investment is falling back. There's another curious thing about China. I don't know whether people spotted, but towards the end of last year, the Chinese trade balance went into deficit. China is maybe China's going to be in its boom. And everything, don't forget, who depends on the Chinese boom? Everyone does. The Germans depend on it. The Italians depend on it. I don't know how country exports.
140. Yeah. That's our ratio there. 140%.
Debt
It went up, yes.
Debt to GDP?
Yeah, it went up in the last month.
Yeah.
Kind of fuse.
Yeah, I mean the
GDP went down.
Sorry?
Because the GDP went down.
Yeah.
I think there's a general question. You said that the only way to reduce the debt is through inflation.
Yeah.
But during inflation, the poor get poorer and the rich don't care, because if I have assets, bills, I don't care. Inflation doesn't touch me. We are in gain.
Yeah.
So that means that the only way to reduce the debt is to have the poor people pay for it.
Yeah. That's no, but I'm saying that's a disadvantage of doing it through inflation. But I'm saying, but the more fundamental disadvantage is that who controls inflation? No one does, because inflation is determined by the shopkeepers, by individual shopkeepers, and not by governments, even though they think they do. They think they control inflation with inflation targeting and so on, but it's not. That's an illusion.
So the opportunities that are on the table are some sort of scary austerity program that won't work anyway.
Yeah.
Or inflation, which will just socialize the costs and hurt the poor. Yeah, or a crisis.
Yeah, or a financial crisis, yeah.
Or some sort of thing that will mobilize the economy, like a big war or something that would...
Yeah. Yes, that's right. But don't forget, in war mobilizes the economy. It also creates inflation, which helps manage this debt. Britain ended the Second World War with a debt to GDP ratio of 300%. Perfectly manageable within the banking system. If you can actually set up the banking system to operate on a large, in fact it's very good for the banking system to have a large amount of government debt. As the Italians, your banks are stable. Yeah, because you have large amounts of government debt in them. But one of the reasons is you have large amounts of government debt in them. So the governments can cope with it. What brought down the debt to GDP ratio in Britain was not austerity, fiscal austerity. It actually came down in the early years of Margaret Thatcher's government because of inflation. It was very high, 25% at one point. In the 1970s, debt fluctuated, the inflation in the UK fluctuated between 10 and 25%. Wiped out a huge amount of this debt. Well, in real terms.
So if the alternative to that is some sort of redistribution or nationalization project or something like that, what would that, I'm trying to think, what would that do to inflation?
You might get inflation, but
But you do social, yeah.
Providing it's under control. I mean, obviously you don't want inflation on the scale that Zimbabwe has it, but you can have inflation on the. I mean, there are. Nicholas Caldor was a great advocate of having a moderate pace of inflation, just to stop people holding on to money, and effectively to act as a tax on people who own financial assets. It's a way of taxing people who own financial assets.
I just wanted to get you on video arguing for the redistribution and nationalization of fantastic.
No, I'm very much in favour of redistribution. Actually, the most important thing is to have a much more equal distribution of income, because that stabilises that stabilises financial markets much more, and then nationalisation. Well, yes, you need to nationalise. Particularly, what you really need to do is put under social control the process of investment, because it's investment that's key. And this is what you find in China. China has the Chinese government. You have a socialist system in China. Well, actually, Charles Goodhart, the monetary economist, always. When he once said to me, the problem with China is that they have communism, but they don't have socialism. You don't have a proper welfare state in China. You have, people have to pay their own medical. If you live outside the cities, you don't get a pension and this kind of thing. So you need. China needs that kind of socialism. But you know what? The thing about China is that the central government does not control the whole economy. It doesn't control the allocation of consumer goods or anything else like this. This is largely left to local government, private enterprise, and anything else like that. The way the central government operates in China and controls the economy is through its control of key investment projects, and those are the ones that it uses to try and distribute economic activity around the country and keep the economy going.
That's not really a question, it's an opinion. We talk about debts and Minsky's theory of debts, but it's more in developed countries and transition economies. But I was thinking throughout the time, because in my country where I come from, that is becoming an issue. I had a conversation with a friend back there the other day. I mean, the banks, we have few commercial banks, which are mainly Nigerian banks, whatever. And the debt level within these banks is really increasing because people take up debt and they can't honor their debt because interest rate is extremely high, it's like 20% interest rate. And the central bank can do nothing in terms of regulation. There's no specified, which Sierra Leone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the central bank doesn't. It doesn't regulate the interest rate, and obviously the legal systems can't really handle the process of debt. How do I say this? Getting this money back from the market. And I mean, in a situation like that, what's the solution? Because from what I see, where I stand, I can see a crisis waiting to happen in like almost all the banks, because the debt level, there's no official figure of the debt level, because only the Bank of Sierra Leone has the official figures and they don't disclose such figures. But with the practices and there's no basically formal regulation, it's like, I mean, and inflation is high, so inflation cannot definitely be used to control the debt level. I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Well, no, if you have high inflation, then it will tend to wipe that out. The problem in Sierra Leone is if people start borrowing in dollars, because if you borrow foreign currency, then you're now inflation proofed, and that's a dangerous thing, because you now prevent inflation from wiping out this debt. And in fact, depending on the exchange rate, this debt could go even higher. So that's a very, very serious thing. Then the second thing is if people try to default on their debts in a country where you don't have proper commercial law, the way in which people enforce contracts is by gangsterism, which incidentally they have in Japan. Ah yes, another story about Japan. But it's relevant to this because it shows you how debt systems operate in a semi-legal system. A friend of mine, I was talking to a friend of mine about about private equity funds which invest in buy up companies, restructure them, and then sell them at a higher price. She said that she'd been working in a private equity company in Tokyo. In Japan, they have these figures that appear. Oh, she said that they hadn't, because of the depression, they hadn't been able to make any money out of buying companies and restructuring them, and you still couldn't sell them for any amount of money. So what they were doing was that they were buying distressed assets. In other words, assets which had debts against them, and they had problems getting the debts out. So what they would do is they would buy, one of the distressed assets is real estate with debts against it. So the equity funds were doing is buy huge chunks of real estate, and they would go through block by block, throwing out the tenants of the house, people were living in the house, and then selling the house, and then recovering it. And the money that, having thrown the tenants out, they would get much more money than what they paid for it. So she said that and they would do this systematically. So you had this block on a map, and you'd go one by one through each of the properties. Except that what you would find is every now and again you would find in this block there would be a house with an unbelievable amount of debt against it. Really unbelievable, which made me wonder, how did this happen? And that was usually a warning that you didn't try and throw the people out, because those were the Yakuza. The Yakuza are the gangs that do like a protection racket among the companies. They turn up at company general meetings, and the company has to pay them to stay away, because otherwise they turn up and they create a nuisance. Anyway, she said to me that if you find one of those houses, then you really have to do a calculation. How much money do you actually really need to get them out to make a profit on this block that you bought? You have to go very, very carefully with them. He said, you can get them out. You can get a bigger gang of people, thugs to throw them out. Then you can get them out. And she said that JP Morgan, with one of their equity funds, did this. And it was very embarrassing because about a couple of weeks later, they came into the JP Morgan office, with baseball bats. It was very unpleasant for all the customers of JP Morgan. So I don't do this type of thing. But this is, this is debt. That's how debt dynamics work when you can't go through the courts. Terrible. And I think that's, in particular with unofficial debt. In India, people commit suicide, or you have people ostracized from communities. Microfinance has become very, very big, but it's now, there are scandals associated with microfinance as well. Yunus, the guy who started the whole movement, has just been fired from the bank that he set up. I think it's so as being that kind of a place, someone had, there was some kind of event about Eunice, which was headed how to make lots and lots of money putting poor people into debt. That's what they do.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much.